Haha. Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Okay, great. Sorry about that. So we have Brooke and Rebecca, and I think that's it right now. And we may have some join us in a bit. Caleb, don't be worried if they do. Just real quick, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight is actually Caleb Boardman. He's the UW Livestock Judging Coach going into his 3rd year. And I guess probably Brooke, you know him, and I don't know about Rebecca, probably do too. So with that, I'll just go ahead and let you get started. Tonight's topic is on selection. So go ahead, Caleb.
All right, very good. If you guys have questions as you go along, unfortunately for you two, your contemporaries aren't on here, so that means you two will get picked on more often and they'll have to catch up afterwards. So I'm going to try to share the screen here. Figure out how to do this. There we go. All right, can you guys see my slideshow?
Perfect.
Okay, very good. So like Robin said, we're going to talk tonight about selection some. And so mainly this module was supposed to be about structure and conformation. And so that's what we'll try to discuss throughout the night. Cross species, we're not going to hit on rabbits or poultry tonight. That'll be in a separate module there that we'll talk about when we talk more so about the market animal side. Today we're going to focus a little more on the breeding animal side and the structure more so of that, and focus more so on the livestock species and horses just a little more and try to get through it here. So our objectives tonight is to cover what structure is, why it is important, and where we evaluate it on animals. So Brooke or Rebecca, tackle the first one. Okay, what is structure? What do you guys think structure is?
I think to be like how the animal is made from the ground up, like from who that animal's parents are to what he is, and kind of along with that structure is how you raise that animal also plays an important part on their structure.
Okay.
Hey, Brooke. Brooke, I think we have a TV or something going in the background and we can hear it. So if you could kind of try to turn it on. Thanks.
There we go.
Okay, perfect. Rebecca, do you have any additional thoughts?
Not really. Like she said, structure is like how the animal is built, and when you look for it, you're looking for like nice and wide on the rump and up in the shoulders and stuff, so that those genes hopefully get passed on.
Okay, very good. And so I think you guys hit it. So structure today, we'll talk about, mainly we're going to talk about the structure being considered kind of the skeleton of the animal. And we're going to break down the skeleton a little more and understand that. We will talk a little bit about why it is important in each animal and where we evaluate it. So as we go through here, so again, we're going to talk more so about the bone of the animal, the skeletal structure. We'll talk about some on the volume of it, talk about their design a little bit, and touch briefly on the skeletal maturity, although I'm not going to talk very much about the skeletal maturity tonight. So as we talk about defining structure, structure, as you look it up in a dictionary, is an arrangement of parts in a substance or body. And so what does that mean in livestock terms? Well, it should mean their skeletal design. How is that skeleton laid together? How do they move? And how are their feet and legs kind of put together? In livestock, we may hear a lot of whether they are sound or not, whether they can, how correctly they can walk or not, would be kind of considering what a lot of people think about structure. But we're also going to talk about their skeleton as a whole. And so we're going to talk a lot about volume as well, why volume is important in each of these species, and that conformation through there. So as we talk about some areas to evaluate, the front skeleton, we're going to want to really look at the angle to their shoulder. A lot of people like to talk about how animals balance and how those animals fit together. And all of that is a direct reflection of how their bones are laid onto their body. So if we really talk about the anatomy of an animal, everything that correlates together is how they balance, how they move, is all going to be a direct correlation of how those bones lay onto their body. And so up to their front end, we'll talk about the different species of what the angles of those shoulders should be like, up through their knee, down in their pastern. We'll talk about their rear skeleton, about their hip or their croup in horses. We'll talk about the set to their hock and how different species, livestock versus horse, is just a little differently there. Also need to look at flexibility they have at their spine. In all species, the size and shape of their hoof is very important, and understanding what affects that down there at the ground, okay? So if we look at evaluating soundness and we talk about a sound animal, we're going to talk about their feet and legs, how their feet and legs are put together all the way through. If an animal is correctly put together and their structure is correct, they are typically going to be very level designed, and all these angles that we look at are going to be fairly correct. We will talk about each of these angles here throughout the night, but that's what we're looking at specifically, is how this skeleton is put together. And so especially when we talk about soundness in the skeleton, we're looking at the angles. Later we'll talk about volume, and again, that will be more so the rib cage that we're talking about. Okay, so cattle, it's important from a commercial setting. Cattle need to be structurally sound because they can get out and they have to cover large areas to be able to walk on a daily basis. So especially here in the region we live in Wyoming, there's a lot of pastures that are a couple thousand acres perhaps, and those animals have to be able to get out and move over long periods of time. They have to be able to go out and forage. They're a ruminant animal, and so that's what we use those for, is for them to get out and kind of convert low quality forages into high quality protein and end product there in the meat. And so that's kind of how we correlate everything together here through animal science, is what happens. Well, in order to do that, they have to be able to get out and move and walk. And so that's very important for them. They have to be able to do their job. And for cattle, that means getting out and walking long distances. So as we talk about some different angles and different things, what do you guys, have you been taught anything about what are some good angles that we should think about in livestock?
You want the shoulders to be nice and like a 45, and like the back end you want it nice and level, like from like the withers to the round.
Okay, very good. Very good, Rebecca. And Brooke, you got anything on there?
I've been taught that, like, yes, 90-degree angles, and you kind of want them to be like a box, kind of square, like right when they come off that dock and they drop straight down and very well, what do I want to say, framed.
Okay, very good. I think both of you guys are correct on different areas. So we'll definitely talk about some 90-degree angles up over the hip. Rebecca, you kind of hit on it on a lot of areas of the actual feet and legs. 45 degrees is a good number to remember there. All right, so the slope of the shoulder needs to be a 45-degree angle. We'll talk about their pasterns being a 45-degree angle. So this level line kind of being boxy, that is definitely very good, Brooke, like you talked about, and being kind of square out of their hip, both of you talked about. We need to make sure there's not too level there. There may be some problems if we keep them too level, and we want them boxy as far as being wide and kind of square in their build. We'll talk about, we don't want them to be too boxy or post-legged in their actual structural design. So we will talk about some foot design here in a second. There's some breed-specific problems we won't hit on a ton here in this lecture, but different breeds have some problems with different specific structured problems. So it definitely on all animals, and we'll specifically start with cattle here, the hoof is very important to look at and to select on, and probably isn't looked at enough by evaluators to understand what's important. The hoof is where everything kind of starts at. And part of the reason that we want a 45-degree angle is because as an animal moves, all of their weight is going down onto their joints, just like as humans, if we walk and move. And so as we talk about structural correctness, it's going to be dictating on how much cushion is in that particular animal. And so the joints are what kind of absorb the shock as an animal moves. And we want that animal to be comfortable, and we want that animal to, again, be structurally sound. And so it starts at the ground, and we don't want incorrect hoof shape. And so we'll look at in a little bit of what we consider sickle hocked here. Sickle hocked is going to be too much set to the hock, where they're not putting very much weight on their toes. That can really cause some excessive toe growth and cause some problems, especially in cattle, with getting really long toes to where you'd have to have a foot trimmer come in, and can cause some lameness based on that not being built correctly out of the angle to their hock and how they wear down their feet. We can also look at the shape of their toes is going to be very important, and we want kind of a wide square toe, and we want it to be a kind of a boxy toe where they're not going to have problems with curling that toe in or having these small short toes. And so two animals that we consider too straight or post-legged are going to walk up on their tippy toes, and they're going to have really small feet and short toes. And the problem with that is we think about cushion absorbers and shock absorbers, and the more cushion they have, that's going to be more comfortable. And so you think Dr. Scholl's, if you put Dr. Scholl's on your feet, you put that in there as you go down, you kind of have some cushion to sit down into, and that's why that's such a popular product for people to buy. If you're really straight up and down on your tippy toes, that's going to be uncomfortable, and there's less cushion there to absorb that shock, and it's going to kind of hurt the animal more. And so we want this correct 45-degree angle right through here. If they have too much angle here through their pastern, can be some problems, again, causing this toe to grow out too long. You can start to see right here this toe starting to grow out. Perhaps one's going to grow longer than the other, and this is going to curl around, and it's going to be problematic. Here, when we get them too straight, and oftentimes people that are involved in the show ring as kind of club calf producers, they've done a poor job of keeping structural correctness in mind, and they get those animals that are too straight in their legs, and they take a really short stride, and if they had to kind of go out and live in what I'd consider the real world, they would struggle to kind of survive out there. And so you can see we get a lot smaller foot here, where we're going to get less cushion to absorb that shock, and then we may see some really small, short inside toes here. This can also be a problem I showed earlier on that slide, kind of being screw-toed in bulls. That's going to be very problematic. Those toes are going to curl in towards each other, and it'll actually overlap each other, and that can cause some severe lameness. So the Angus Association has actually started trying to develop an EPD. You guys have talked about being able to pass on to their offspring this structural correctness, which is also an important reason to put emphasis on structure in selection, is because as breeding animals, they are passing that on, and we don't want them to have offspring and progeny that are going to be structurally incorrect as they go to market and different things. And so this is the Angus foot scoring system that they talk about. And so you can kind of see here on the angle of the pastern, so the foot angle is what they talk about. 5 and 6 is going to be pretty ideal on both of these. 5 is what they consider the most ideal, but 4 to 6 is pretty acceptable. As we talk about 1 through 3 or 7 through 9 here, we're going to see that it's starting to get some severe structural problems that start to happen. And so as you evaluate animals, think about how they are down at the ground. And here on cattle, we want them to have a nice kind of 45-degree angle to their pastern, nice square shape to their foot and their claw set here, and make them have some good shock absorption. Right? So their front structure, as we talk about a little further up, and I'll get a little repetitive throughout the night as we switch from species to species, because a lot of it is the same, but hopefully it'll kind of pound in your head the longer we go. All right, and so this front structure here is going to be, we want, again, kind of this 45-degree angle through their shoulder right here. So if we draw that line right there, look through that. If we draw a straight line down here from their knee, their shoulder up, that should be about a 45-degree angle. If we get it too straight up and down, where we get right here, we start to get some problems down in the knee, and that all that straightens up and their joints all straighten up and they lose any cushion that they may have, and that shock absorption that we've talked about. Okay. If we get too much set here and too much angle, again, we can cause some long toes. And this is typically what we'll see is what we'll call calf need. And calf need is going to be when they're kind of backwards at their knee. So when those animals are actually backwards at their knee, they're calf need. All right. What species, do you guys know what species calf need is the biggest kind of discrimination against, or the biggest fault in? Cattle, sheep, goats, swine, or horses? Which one is calf need the worst in?
Cattle?
Okay, cattle, yeah, that's a good guess based off of it being called calf meat. Okay, it's actually not terrible in our livestock species. Where it's going to get the worst, and we'll talk about it towards the end, is actually in horses. Selecting against horses, it's very bad because as you think about kind of conformation to performance on horses, what happens in, hopefully you can you guys still see me or not, or is it just my screen?
No,
You're
we
good.
I can see you.
You can see me, okay? So if you think about, if my elbow here is the front knee, and if that goes backwards, what a horse has to do is actually make two movements when they're running and doing performance. And so that knee sits backwards, and they actually have to prop it forward before they can pick their leg up. And so from a performance standpoint, that's definitely discriminated against. In cattle, and in our livestock species, typically too much angle to their skeletons is going to be much better and less problematic than too straight of angles. The biggest problem is when we straighten those angles, because again, we're losing all of that shock absorption. Okay, so again, similar here is what we just saw. So that angle through the shoulder is being pretty ideal. Okay, as we talk about the slope of the shoulder, what is one thing that that is important in that 45-degree angle? What does that predict on an animal? Any thoughts? What can you tell based on the slope of the shoulder?
Which one are you asking about?
So the slope of the shoulder on any of these, what is the slope of the shoulder? What do we correlate some things with on slope of shoulder?
How much muscle they have on it?
Okay, so might be some muscle, okay?
Balance.
It definitely helps with their balance, right? If we get them too straight. Okay, so a couple things that'll happen that correlates with is that from a balance standpoint, you can kind of see this animal right here, his neck's quite a bit shorter. And that's because as we push that shoulder blade forward, they have less length of neck to be there. So from a balance standpoint, that's true. Probably the most practical reason that it gets through here in this angle of the shoulder is important is it's actually going to predict and be a very accurate predictor of how far they can step out of their front leg. All right, and so if we draw this angle of the shoulder all the way down to the ground down here, if this bull right here was out in motion, we would expect that animal to be able to step about to right there, right? So they would be able to take kind of a long stride to there. When we get too much set, it doesn't really lengthen their stride any because it actually, again, that calf need can cause some problems there. But you can see right here, if we draw that down to the ground, that animal's only going to take that long of a step. And so we consider that very short stride. And what actually makes them have a very short, choppy stride is when they're too straight in that angle. And so that's what predicts how far they can actually move that front leg in the length of the stride out of the front skeleton is that angle of the shoulder. So it's very important to look at. Okay, we can also look at deviations from the front view. And so we want them to be very square, like Brooke was talking about, kind of being very boxy and square here. And from this angle, we definitely want them to be very boxy. And so from the point of the shoulder, on pretty much every species, we want to be able to draw from the point of that shoulder down through their knee and down through their hoof, right through the middle is an ideal draw. All right. If we get to what we consider knock need, that's where we also consider it to be splay-footed. All right, so their toes are going to point out. And they're going to be knock-kneed or splay-footed. Typically, this is going to be a correlation from them being too straight in their shoulder. This is going to cause a problem. Everything is correlated in the skeleton. So if we go back and we see that this is too straight right up here, typically they're going to have to break down in one way or the other, and they're going to have to bow out or kind of come in at their leg. And the same will be from behind, as we talked about from behind. All right, bow-legged, again, it's to where we see a bow here, just like a human that's bow-legged. This would be also referred to as pigeon-toed down at the ground. Which of these is worse, being knock-kneed or bow-legged, do you think?
Knock-kneed?
Okay, not bad. Okay, both are not good. So
I don't
probably,
know. I'm kind of iffy on that.
what's that?
I don't know. I'm kind of iffy on both of them. Like,
Yeah, they're both bad from like a muscle standpoint. Being knock-kneed, a lot of times knock-kneed animals have less muscle and they have less some maybe balancers. From a true structure standpoint, though, bow-legged is going to be a little bit worse, because if you think about it, as they're walking out on the outside of their toe right here, right, and then look right through here, all of the pressure and all of that weight is going to get put on the outside of that leg, and it's going to really affect right through there those knees. And so similar, okay, I'm going to skip a couple down here and I'll come back. If we think about bow-legged from behind compared to cow-hawk, right, just like a bow-legged human, if you think about, the old, you might know someone that's really bow-legged. Sometimes horse people get bow-legged if they ride a saddle too much. They just naturally start to get bow-legged. And as they start to walk, these joints on humans, their knees would start to be really bad, because that's where all the pressure starts to be. And so bow-legged humans are typically going to have problems with their knees, because that's where all the shock absorption is happening at. All the weight's getting put there on your hock of the animal or the knee of a person, okay? So again, straight-shouldered, we talked about being too short-strided, and they're going to have to move their leg more times to cover the same distance as an animal with a correct slope. Right, down at the ground, weak pasterns, we don't want them to be too weak. That can be cause problems with not only their foot structure, but also the tendons down through there can cause some problems with those sesamoid bones, and can cause, again, some problems just structurally. Not as bad as being too straight, but it's not as good as ideal. Right, so as we talk here on their rear structure, we can see that we want a pretty straight, so it's going to be similar to horses, is that we want from kind of their pin bones right here. So in cattle, we'll talk their hook bones are going to be right up here, kind of where my mouse is, and kind of the front part of their hip, and their pin bones are the back part of their pelvis right there. We want that to be very long and level out of their hip, and we want that from the pin bone to drop down to be pretty straight here on the back side of their leg. But we still want that nice angle up at the front side. All right, we don't want it to be too straight and where it kind of runs down the middle of this. So typically this leg would even be a little further back, and you actually kind of get it running right down the middle of this leg, and that becomes problematic. So again, sickle-hocked sickle-hocked truthfully is more of an aesthetic issue, where it just makes them not balance very well. If we think about just animals in general in the animal kingdom, what are some animals that are very sickle-hocked? So too much set back here. You guys think of any animals that have way too much set to their back leg, of what we would consider sickle-hocked?
I don't know.
Can't think of any? Okay, think of, Rebecca, can you think of anything? Not necessarily livestock species, but just any animal in general.
Like kangaroo?
Okay, kangaroo, good, that's probably true. I don't study kangaroos a lot, but I believe that. How about cats, dogs, deer? Do they kind of have an angle to their back leg similar to this? Right, so we kind of think about kind of being extra set down there and having this, a slang term in livestock, Judge, you might be kind of panther-legged, would be this too much sets, or what we call sickle-hocked. And so it's not necessarily detrimental to structure, because actually, if you look at kind of evolution and natural selection of animals, if you don't put any selection pressure on and actually let animals select by themselves, similar to what deer would do or wild animals would do, they actually have a little more slope to their hip than what we select for in livestock. And so that's something that sometimes gets a little contradictory, is sometimes we try to make animals too level in their hip and a little too straight in their hock. And that's actually quite a bit more detrimental to structural correctness and just survivability than what we'd see if we have too much set there. Bow-legged, again, is going to be worse than cow-hocked. Biggest problem with being cow-hocked is that those are going to be typically pretty light-muscled animals. And so we talk about kind of structure to kind of conformation correlations. Cow-hocked animals are typically going to be narrower constructed animals that don't have very much muscle, and that's going to be problematic on them. All right. What's a good predictor of length of stride out of their back skeleton? How long of a step are they going to be able to take out of their back skeleton, do we think? What's going to be a good predictor of that? Any ideas? Right. So it'll actually be length of hip. Right? So the
Okay.
length of their hip is going to predict. And so a lot of times when we look at really straight-legged animals or post-legged animals, they're going to have a pretty short hip, and that means they're going to be able to take a very short stride. So typically, if you look at the length from their hooks to their pins, and then kind of put that from their front foot, their back foot, that's about how long of a step they're going to be able to take. One thing, especially in judging cattle, that can be very important when you're making selection decisions and deciding which replacement animals to select and keep back as heifers, is that a structurally sound animal, and especially cattle, sheep are the same way, horses are the same way, should be able to fill their track. So where they pick their front foot up at, they should be able to put their back foot down kind of in the exact same location, in the same hole. And ideally, it's with no deviations. We'll talk in horses of maybe swinging their legs in or out, and that's a kind of a flaw there. We want them to take a kind of a straight step forward and be able to fill their track is what we call that. All right, so again, here's the hock set here. We don't want them to be underneath themselves. We may refer to that as being camped under. But again, the bigger problem is being post-legged. In cattle, the biggest problem with post-legged or bow-legged is in bulls, actually. You really don't want to select any animals that have that flaw in your male animals, mainly because when they go to reproduce, they're going to mount the cow or a ram or anything, a stallion. All of them are going to have to go and mount the female. And when they actually go breed, they'll actually extend up onto their back leg. And if they're too straight, that actually can be what we consider being blown out in their hock. And that hock joint will actually kind of separate some, and there'll be swelling there, and it'll cause that animal to be lame. And if that happens, they will not be able to breed any more animals until it heals. And so if you only have that one animal out with your cows, chances are they would come back and you would have a lot of dry cows at the end of the year because they wouldn't physically be able to breed that animal. Okay, so talked about sickle hocked already. Post-legged we've talked about as well. So I believe these slides will be posted. So if you're trying to take notes on definitions or anything, look back, and to get through everything, I'll kind of skip through some of these definitions. Again, cow-hocked, we talked about kind of turning in at their hock and being narrow at their base. That's mainly going to, again, correlate here to being light muscled and being narrow tracking, which is going to be detrimental to the amount of muscle that they can have on their skeleton. Bow-legged, again, we talked about having hocks too far apart, and they are going to consider what we roll off of their rear toes. All right, so if we talk about some movement predictions and try to predict some movement based on here, this particular bull, we would say, is probably too straight here in the angle of his shoulder. He's a little too straight here in his hock. And so as we predicted him to move, we would expect him to take a little shorter step out of his front skeleton and also a little shorter step out of his rear skeleton. You can see he's already coming up a little bit in his top line. That's the other thing that's good to evaluate for, is to see if they have some give to their top line and some looseness of spine, and that, because that means flexibility. And so this animal might be a little too tight there in his top line. All right, and so that's kind of walks you through this and talks about that here on this particular slide. So Rebecca, how do you think this one would move? What do we think of his angles of his shoulder through his knee here, his posture, and what do we think of this particular animal?
I think he moved fairly good.
Okay, looks like he be decently sound. All right, again, just like the last one, we might see that he's a little straight here in the angle of his shoulder. And as we look down here, it almost looks like he's leaning forward on his tippy toes a little bit, right? So that's not necessarily ideal. If they ever look like they're leaning forward on their tippy toes, that's going to be not ideal. He's okay down here. We can't really see the size of his feet. Maybe a little bit short in his hip, a little posty-legged right back here on the backside. Probably be functional, but a little bit straight. Brooke, do you think this one's better structured or worse structured?
I know.
Look at the angle of the shoulder, length of hip, set to back leg.
I think he's a little better than.
Okay, I would definitely agree. So if we compare back here, can we see now that this one's a little straight here in the shoulder? If we predicted this down to the ground, we can see here, we don't want them to be completely calf-kneed, but we want a little bit of a backward set to their leg here, and we kind of want a little bit of that C shape to their back leg as well. And so you can see that here where we see a little more cushion down to their posture. We see a little more flexibility and cushion at the hock. And we definitely see a little more correct slope of shoulder in this particular animal. And so we'd expect this heifer to be a pretty sound structured animal, all right? If we look at this particular bull, right, he's maybe starting to look like he leans forward a little bit again. He looks like he's pretty upright in his shoulder. That knee is starting to be kind of pointed forward. If we look down here in their pastern and we talk about foot size and pastern, we see that that pastern right here starts to get pretty up and down, especially on that offside hind leg is what we would refer to that as. And so we would expect kind of, if you've ever seen an animal that kind of what we call knuckles on their pasterns, where they put their pastern down like this, and then it sets down and it kind of breaks and pops down into that pastern. And that is definitely not a good trait to have. And so this particular bull, we would not consider to be extremely sound. Whereas this bull is on the opposite end of the extreme. He's maybe starting to maybe have almost a little too much set to his back leg, and we can see he's starting to get a little weak down here in his pastern. And so ideally we'd like to strengthen him up a little bit in his pastern. Really good angle to his shoulder up here through his front skeleton. Really good set and bend to his knee. And so it looks like structurally that he has some pretty good conformation to him, other than he be a little stronger there on his pasterns. All right. As we switch over and go from skeleton and kind of structural correctness on how they move on their feet and legs, go to volume and think about volume. What is the equation from a math standpoint? If someone asks you the volume of a cylinder or a volume of something, what's the equation mathematically for volume?
Length times width times height.
Very good. Length times width times height. And volume in livestock is going to be the exact same equation as we think about the volume of their kind of center body. And so here on this particular animal, we want to look at length. We want to look at height is going to be kind of the depth here. So this would be the height portion of that. And then the rib shape, so kind of the outward turn of that and how wide that is, the width of their base would all go into the width component. So length times width or rib shape times height or depth of body would be that equation of how much volume we consider to have in an animal. Why is volume important when we're selecting breeding animals especially?
Because you want, the bigger the volume, the better it can carry the calf or whatever.
Okay, very good. So to carry that particular animal, so here in cattle, the calf. Okay, Brooke, what do you think on volume? Anything else?
Also, kind of like, if they're, as far as like market-wise, you probably will end up with more product. The bigger the volume when you go to slaughter them because sometimes they do end up having tons of product being big.
Okay, very
I don't
good.
know if that makes sense.
Yep. So they typically have more muscle if they have more rib and volume, right? Is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we'll definitely talk about that a little bit in lab this weekend, but also more so in the next module when we talk about market animals and muscle. But you're absolutely right. If we think about the rib cage, that's where the muscle actually lays on top of. It is on top of that rib cage. And so for them to be able to have muscle, they need some volume. So both of you are exactly right. Rebecca, you are correct on it kind of increases their ability to carry some babies. It also is a good indicator of what I consider doability. So usually if they have more volume to their body, that means they're going to be what I consider an easier flesher. So that means they're going to be more efficient at converting feed to kind of body condition and being able to kind of maintain enough flesh on their body to be in the right condition. And those are important things. And the main reason that correlates is because if there's more volume there, there's also more space for their guts. And all that rumen and anything that happens inside of there, they're going to have more space for that, and they're going to have a bigger area. They're going to be able to eat more, and they're going to be able to stay in better condition accordingly. So kind of 3 or 4 big reasons there that volume is important. Right? So again, we want to look at rib shape and body depth. And so from a 3/4 view, we want to look at the outward turn of the rib cage. It's not just on all depth. We don't want them to just be deep. We want them to have a bold rib cage there. So there's more internal volume and carrying capacity. And then like Brooke said, we want to be able to lay muscle on top of that rib cage. All right. And then again, it kind of facilitates their ability to gain well. Usually big ribbed, high volumed animals will gain more efficiently. From the profile view, we do want them to be depth. So the height part of that equation, like we talked about, is the body depth into there. And we want them to be deep down into their heart girth or into their forerib and down into their flank. We want them to be deep as well. And so those are some good places to look at. All right, if we look at here, which ones look like they're higher volumed and have a little more rib shape and doability, do we think?
Top one.
Okay, top one. Okay, so this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then,
I'm kind of thinking the one right underneath it.
Okay, good. I would agree with you both. I'd agree with you, Rebecca. This one is very deep and has a lot of volume. And I'd agree with you, Brooke, that this one has quite a bit of volume. And so if we look at from the side here, this depth of rib, we can see kind of this height part of the equation here is quite a bit better in both of these. And this isn't supposed to be a breed lecture or anything through theirs. They just both happen to be black-hided of these pictures that I have always show. So it's not necessarily specifically a breed thing, although as you covered breeds, you maybe did learn that British-based cattle, or kind of like Red Angus, Herefords, are a more maternal breed, and correspondingly, those breeds do typically have a little more volume. Whereas we talk about continental breeds that have a little more muscle, they're typically going to have a good shape of their rib, but they're typically a little what we consider higher maintenance, not quite as maternal, and correspondingly, they're not going to keep their flesh on them quite as well. And so both this Charolais cow and this limousine appearing heifer are a little shallower bodied and a little harder doing, and not quite as practical through there. All right, that is going to correlate directly on the cattle side to their fleshing ability. And on the cattle side, it's important to evaluate, and you'll probably talk about it some in your nutrition section at some point, but body condition scoring, we want to talk about, and that's going to range in cattle from a 1 to a 9. Ideally, a 5 is going to be pretty ideal. Some people will consider a 6 to be ideal, but as a whole, most people will say 5 is about the ideal body condition score to have a cow in throughout the year. If we talk about the show ring, fat heifers oftentimes as 4-H FFA members and people competitively showing on a national basis, even breeders showing them, typically will get their heifers too fat. It makes them look better. It makes them look a little deeper and wider, and so there's some benefits of that. But it definitely has some repercussions from a fertility standpoint. And if we get animals too fat, that fat actually lays in around the reproductive tract, it lays down on the ovaries, and they have a harder time ovulating and conceiving that animal. So if they're less than a 5, we'll also see them not having as good of a chance of breeding because their body is telling them there's not enough feed resources for me to be able to reproduce. So actually it will send signals to the body saying, we don't have enough feed here. We're too skinny to be able to reproduce, okay? Where we look at body condition score on an animal is going to be kind of up over their back. We're going to look at their hooks and pin bones. We're going to look to see if we can see their ribs. And so this is kind of a definition if you want to look at it. That's this Herd and Sprout were the original kind of ones that really adapted this 1 to 9 system. So I'll go briefly here through what they look like. One is an emaciated cow. Kind of looks like death warmed over. You can see every rib. So this is the hook bones we were talking about earlier. This is the pin bones back here that we were talking about. And so that cow is obviously very unhealthy. That would be a body condition score of a 1. A 2, you can start to see, you see the last ribs, but not as much. Okay, as we get to a 3, we can still see the hook bones, a little bit of the spine, but there's starting to be some fill. The muscle hasn't deteriorated like it has on the earlier species. 4, again, the hook bones are starting to go away where they look ganted up or skinny right here on their side starts to go away some. Okay, this 5 is start to be pretty close to an ideal. We can't see ribs anymore. We can't see their spine. They look to be very practical and they start to have some good body volume and are able to be efficient there. Obviously, if we starve any animal and don't provide the nutrition, those animals would decrease in body condition score. But the volume that we're talking about helps them under the same conditions. The higher volume, the more rib shape they have, the more likely they'll stay in a good body condition score. Okay, this cow, this Hereford cow, is starting to get a little bit of brisket down here, starting to be a little fatter. As we get up through the 7s, we start to see some big fat deposits laid on throughout. We get through an 8, we start to see a really fat animal. And as we get to a 9, we see these great big pones of fats all the way through there. And that cow would probably not be able to reproduce still. All right. So we'll transition briefly here into hogs. And so just like in cattle, we're going to talk about the angles of their skeleton, and it's going to be pretty similar. And typically, again, good designed hogs are going to be very level in their makeup. So why it's important on the hog side of things is we talked about cattle having to walk long distances. Hogs aren't so much that way, but hogs are going to be raised in confinement areas. And there's good reasons, why hogs are raised that way. From a biosecurity standpoint, hogs are very prone to diseases. And so if we raise them in confinement housing, that really allows them to be protected from diseases. They're also not as good at adapting to inclement weather. And so hot and cold, we can control the temperature for the animals in there. And we can also, they don't go out and forage. They're a monogastric system, so they're not able to process forages or kind of carbohydrate type structures, lignin and different structures there. They need more of a cellulose base. And so if you think about easily digestible starches like corn and soybeans is what's going to be the main portion of a pig's diet. And so we can provide that more easily. The drawbacks of this is to keep it sanitary for them. We've got to keep them kind of raised on concrete, right? And if you've stood on concrete all day long ever, at the end of the day, you can definitely start to think about if you have any structural flaws. Your knees may start to hurt a little bit if you're bow-legged or pigeon-toed. Where you put all your weight at is going to start to have some aches and pains a little bit on there. And so hogs need to be very structurally sound, because if not, they will be in pain in this scenario. And that's the last thing we want, is for them to be in pain. It also, from a profit and business standpoint, decreases their likelihood that they want to get up and eat. If an animal's in pain, they're not going to want to feel good and get up and eat. And so accordingly, they're not going to gain quite as well for us. All right. So similarly, we want a good cushion to their shoulder, knee, and pastern. We want a long level hip, just like we talked about in cattle. All right, so here we see a good, in hogs, we can think about really that backward C shape, or almost like a banana shape or shape to a plier handle here up through their front end. And we want a lot of cushion through that knee down into the pastern, and same on the back leg. All right, if we get them too straight right here, you can see this animal consequently gets tight in their spine. They have small toes and they're too post-legged, and that's going to cause that particular hog here, this boar, to be very uncomfortable in their skeleton. Okay, so this particular animal is very incorrect in their skeletal conformation, very post-legged, and this animal would very struggle to get up and walk around, and they'd be in pain, and we definitely don't want to select for that. So we want to select for animals that are comfortable, that can do good. Particular in hogs, weak pasterns can be a big problem in hogs to select against, because especially in that confinement operation where they're on concrete, if they're walking down here on what we call their dew claws, and if they walk on those dew claws, they can actually tear those dew claws off and get some infections in there and cause some lameness. And so we don't want to avoid them being too soft in their pastern to where they walk down on their dew claws. But again, we don't want them to be too straight, because that means they have no shock absorbers there on their skeleton. Okay, so again, normal, just like in cattle, we see a normal view here. We don't want them to be too soft pastured. We also don't want them to be too straight or buck-kneed, being too straight or post-legged up front. Again, we want some good width. We want a long level hip here, are all good things to have. Okay, abnormalities, just like in cattle, we can have splay-footed or pigeon-toed. Both those problems are problematic. In hogs, toes are very important, just like in cattle, but for some different reasons. Their toe structure is actually going to be very good indicators. If they have structural flaws, they're going to have uneven weight distribution on their toes. Humans are the exact same way. If you have a structural flaw, you can actually take your shoe off, look at the bottom of your shoe, and you will tell what kind of structural flaws you have. Get an old pair of cowboy boots or an old pair of shoes, and see there will be parts of the sole of your foot that you put all of your weight on. As you get older and heavier, that starts to really be detrimental to the joints, whether it's your ankle, your knee, or your hip in humans. And in livestock, it's the same way. If we have uneven distribution down there, how we're putting our weight down, that's going to cause uneven wear on our toes. That's going to cause some deviations in our hock, in that animal's hock and hip, and will cause some lameness. The other reason we want a big, even toe in hogs is because, again, they're raised in this confinement setting, and if they have a very small or uneven toe, they can actually step down and injure themselves in here. And so we want to select for big, even toes so they don't injure themselves and have better weight distribution. Straight animals are typically going to be, again, smaller toed. Injuries can occur in there where hogs, it's common for them to get what we call they'll have a pad, a soft spot on the bottom of that foot, and that can actually crack and cause them to be a little bit lame. That's not necessarily a genetic deficiency or a structural deficiency. It's just an injury that we can go through and treat, but it's definitely something to watch for. Okay, so we've talked about this already. I'm going to skip through this. So here we see being too post-legged here, being a bad thing. Sickle-hocked is a little worse in hogs than it is in cattle, mainly because as those animals go to get up and down, if they have too much set to their hock, they're going to actually get some calluses here and some confinement scars is what we would call it. And so we don't want to select for that, again, to where those animals are in pain. Same thing here, so some similar diagrams that we've looked at through here on those. On hogs, volume is going to be important as well. Same thing, three-dimensional look through there. Any ideas on hogs? Why even more so rib shape may be extremely important in hogs, even compared to cattle or sheep or horses? Why rib shape is so important? Maybe either of you think of anything? Okay, so actually, if you've ever seen a hog lay down and get back up, they're actually going to be kind of lay completely down on their side, and especially for breeding animals, sows, that's how their babies are going to nurse, is on their side, where they're completely on their side, and their babies will come up and nurse on their teats on the side. If you watch a pig that's in a farrowing crate there, that sow that's in there, get up, what she'll actually do is rock back and forth on that rib cage. And so as we look here, and these are what farrowing crates are used for, we do that for the safety of the pigs. Okay, a big sow might weigh 400 or 500 pounds, even up to 700-800 pounds. A little baby piglet's going to weigh about 2 pounds. If mama decides to lay down, she lays down pretty quickly. If little 2-pound piglets underneath of there and don't have a space to get away, they're going to obviously get kind of pancaked underneath of there. And so from a safety of the pig standpoint and keeping them as a safe place, we have designed these crates within the industry. The other important reason here is for these hogs to get away. They can get back to the heat lamp. Baby pigs really need a very warm environment, about 90 degrees, where the sow needs a cooler environment, about 70 degrees. And so we can provide the optimal environment for both those animals. But accordingly, as the sow lays down on her side, if she has no rib shape or volume, she won't actually be able to rock and stand back up, and they'll actually get stuck on their side. And so very important for sows to have some rib shape there. Okay, so some variation in body shapes here. We can see this hog is very flat. Okay, and we'll transition to this slide of what that represents is the actual rib cage. All right, this top part is their spine, and this is going to be their rib cage down through here. And that's going to be the main part of that rib cage, and where they have that volume, just like we talked about, to carry babies, to have their guts inside of there, to be able to be efficient and do well. And so this is ideally what we want it to look like. Similar here, okay, we can see a bold rib cage and a bold sprung rib cage. That's what we want to look for. In hogs, this bone, just like in humans, that bone that connects those ribs right there is the sternum bone. And that sternum bone, we want a lot of shape of rib as it feeds out of that sternum, and that rib lays into there, okay? So this hog down in the bottom right obviously has a lot more volume, just like on those cattle that we looked at. We look at the same thing. We looked at depth of body, we look at spring of rib, and we see a lot more volume here in this particular sow than we see in this gilt over on this side. Okay, same thing here. We see these hogs are very narrow constructed and flat ribbed, whereas in this hog, we also see a pretty flat rib cage in there. We see them being narrow underneath, and that width that we have to have for that three-dimensional volume we talk about isn't there. Compared to these hogs that are wide constructed, it's hard to see here, but you can imagine that rib cage, the sternum that we look at there, and we talk about being very bold sprung out of their sternum. That definitely allows for a lot more. And like Brooke talked about earlier, we can see here that both these animals have a lot of muscle. And so when we talk about market animals down the road, that will be a big important factor we'll talk about, as well as rib shape, for them to be able to have muscle down the top side of their skeleton. Okay, sheep and goats, I should have put them together in here. Structurally for them, still going to have some big important issues. We typically don't see as unsound of animals in sheep and goats, mainly because they're a lighter weight species. And so as a mature animal, they might be 150 or 200 pounds, whereas sows, again, boars, again, maybe 500-600 pounds, cattle, 1,500 pounds, some big bulls that may weigh over 2,000 pounds. And so just the weight that's on that joint, they don't have to absorb as much shock there because they don't weigh as much. But there's still definitely some important things. Sheep, more than any other species, are typically in a little rougher, rockier terrain, and in oftentimes, especially here in the Western United States, in very large pasture settings. And so the same type of problems can be problematic. Weak pasture and bow-legged are probably the biggest problems within sheep, is that they're way too weak in terms of their pasture, and that's going to cause them to be unsound and can cause them to be lame. Sheep, like any other species, we want to be very level, and that's going to be a good indication. We want a good long hip. We want good angle to their shoulder and good set back here to their back leg. So these two particular rams are very structurally correct in their look. Whereas we look at these animals and we see them not being as structurally correct. This particular ram, this kind of blue-colored ram, is very weak in his pasterns. That's going to be problematic down there. okay, this animal is a little too straight in his shoulder. You can see it causes him to be up in his spine. Same with this animal. We see a little straight in his hock, a little post-legged off both ends. Those animals, if we turn them out on a range setting to where they have to go cover a lot of ewes on a couple 1,000-acre pasture, would definitely have problems doing that. Some other so volume, I'm not going to talk specifically about in sheep, but the same ideas. Okay, we want them to be very bold in their rib. We want them to be deep and have some volume there. Kind of a skeleton issue that's a little more prevalent in sheep and goats and problematic in sheep and goats than others is our actual mouth soundness. And sheep have to go out and graze. They have to be able to get, and they're ruminant animals, so they only have teeth on the bottom side of their jaw. They have no teeth up on the top side of their jaw. And if they have a problem with that, the bottom teeth meeting up with their palate up on the top side, that can cause them to not be able to actually eat grass and can cause some big detrimental issues. All right. Parrot mouth is what we're going to consider, just like a parrot. It is the common name for an overshot jaw. So an overshot jaw is known as being parrot mouth, and it would be like an overbite in humans. That's problematic. You can see as they go try to eat this or even nurse on their mother, it can cause some problems of being able to nurse on the mother or eat grass. And so that's not able to eat up. And as they went to try to tear that grass off, they would struggle. They would not be able to fulfill their nutrients there in that particular animal. Monkey mouth is the opposite. So it'd be an underbite or an undershot jaw. Is this bottom jaw is kind of out past there. This top jaw is under, okay, there. I'm sorry, get this straight. The bottom jaw is under the top jaw. And again, you can see that they wouldn't be able to eat there accordingly. And so those are two problems that we see in sheep and goats. Typically, goats have a bigger problem of being monkey mouth or this underbite. Sheep typically have a bigger problem of having an overbite or a parrot mouth. All right, so any question about livestock before we move into some horse evaluation and finish up here in the next 15 minutes or so? No? All right, I will keep going straight along then. So evaluation of horses, we're going to talk about more so their overall conformation here. When we talk in the next module about market animals, we won't talk much about horses because they're not obviously serve as a market animal. We don't raise them for a meat purpose. So we're going to use this chance to talk overall about horse conformation and what we would evaluate and select a horse off of. So these are the 4 criteria of horses: balance, structure, muscling, and then some sex characteristics if it's a breeding horse. And these are in order of the kind of strength that you would select them based off of. So one big difference to realize is that horses, we look at balance as the top priority. If we talk about breeding livestock, the top 2 priorities are what we've talked about this whole time. Structure and volume are going to be the 2 most important factors to look at for in livestock breeding selection. On horses, balance is what we consider the most important thing because we want everything to fit together and proportion well. So in horses, we specifically want them to what we call proportion and split into even thirds. And so we look here, we kind of see these 3 circles drawn on this horse. That's what we want. We want those proportions to be very even and equal between kind of the shoulder area, the barrel is what we would call it in horses, and the croup back here. Okay, so in cattle, we kind of call it the shoulder, the rib, and the hip. Well, now we call it the shoulder, the barrel, and the croup. And those need to be evenly split up between those 3 things. If their skeleton is correct, those 3 things will balance and very proportionally split into thirds. All right, the slope of the shoulder, and I will give our horse judging coach, Jenny Ingerson, some credit. She helped out in some of her brochures. I used some information from her, as well as the American Quarter Horse Association. So I'm by no means a horse judging expert, and so those 2 sources helped me out here through some of this, and that's where I got some of this from. So again, just like horses, livestock though, horses are still a livestock type species, although we don't consider them a market livestock. They're still livestock, and equine here have a lot of the same parts of the body put together. So just like before, we want that 45-degree angle to their shoulder. That's going to predict how long of a stride they're going to be able to take. All right. We also, in horses, want to talk about being a kind of shorter back relative to a longer underline, and the correct slope to their shoulder will allow that. Here's where we talk about that top to bottom line ratio. So we want them to have a shorter back in relation to a longer underline through there. If they have too long of a back, it will cause them to have some structural flaws, and they won't be able to perform like we would want them to. And it will cause some problems here over their back and their loin, and it will cause some problems. Their neck, we don't necessarily want just a long and thin neck here. We want a very proportional neck. If you've ever actually watched one of my favorite things, horse judging one time, I was talking to a horse evaluator, a gentleman that had been around horses for a long time, and he actually brought out a piece of twine. And he talks about everything should be in proportion. So the length of the neck from the top of the poll down here to the withers, he took a piece of twine and he measured that exact length. And an ideal horse, that is going to be the exact same length as if we go from the withers down to, so the length of the neck here, so from right here up to here will be the same length from the base of the withers down to the point of the shoulder. That should also be the same length as it is back to the top of the croup. And from the top of the croup back down here to the bottom part of the hip should all be the same length. And so all those proportions he showed with a piece of twine are actually all about the exact same length on a very proportional horse. Horses, selection-wise, we'll also talk about them being very high tine in their neck right through here, and not having a very deep kind of prominent neck structure there. Withers, we want a very prominent, sharp wither up at the top of that. If they don't have that, they may have trouble holding a saddle on top of that, and so we want a very prominent, kind of sharp set of withers up at the top side of their skeleton. Their hindquarters, their croup here, unlike livestock species, we want a very nice, gentle, sloping croup here on these horses. And so we want a long croup here and a long hindquarters, but we don't want this to be extremely level out here through their croup. And so we want a nice sloping croup on the horse. Structural correctness, we want their limbs to be very straight and level, just like we talked about before, straight in a standpoint, that they don't deviate in or out at their knee or their hock. And then we want them to be pretty straight here in this bone here as we draw this down in this cannon bone that we look at from the point, just like we talked about in cattle. So on their rear leg, if we talk about from their point of their end points of their croup here, or even if we think about that pin bone being out there, if we draw a straight line, ideally we want that to pass straight down through the backside of this cannon bone and then have a nice 45-degree angle to the pastern right here. On the behind, again, right through that pin bone, we want to come down. We want it to be very even through the hock, down through the fetlock right down here, the pastern, and right down through the middle of the hoof. Like in livestock species we'll talk about, they need to be ideally the widest from stifle to stifle is where the stifle joints are and the stifle muscle is, and ideally we want those to be the widest from stifle to stifle. Some rear leg deviations, we can, just like we saw before, be too straight here. We can have too sickle hocked or be camped under where that leg is completely up underneath it here. On the backside, just like we saw before, we can see too base narrow. We can see being bow-legged. We can be seeing cow-hocked. Any of those problems are going to be problematic. The front leg, just like we saw before, we want a nice angle to that shoulder, but then we want it to drop down very straight and sturdy through the knee. So we don't, especially in horses, want as much of a backward set there that we see in other species. Especially in hogs, we want more of a cushion there up on their front skeleton. In horses, we don't want that quite as much. Here again, we want that the point of the shoulder straight down through the knee, the pastern, and the cannon bone all the way down through the middle of that front hoof to be a very straight line. Problems up front, not any different. Again, we talked about being backwards at the set of their knee is the most detrimental to being horses, or being calf-kneed is going to be the most problematic problem. We can see two base narrow, bow-legged here, knock-kneed, splay-footed. Any of those problems we've talked about before, just like in horses, are going to be horses, just like in livestock, that's going to be problematic. Okay, so again, here we see this calf-kneed problem. They're not going to have support or strength in the leg. Splay-footed is actually when they go and run, they'll actually kind of throw their foot out. That's going to be detrimental to evaluating horses and their performance. Pigeon-toed is going to be the opposite. They're going to throw their foot out. So splay-footed, they're going to bring their leg in and have to deviate. That's going to bring a problem with those problems or performance they're going to have. Okay, our third priority, so we had balance, then we have structure, and we have muscling in horses as still an indicator of good things. Muscling is not the highest priority. We want adequate muscle to do the job, but we don't want to have overly bunchy muscle. If we look back here, I don't have a muscle picture here, but if we look back at a good horse, we want a lot of muscle down here through their croup and down through their hindquarter. This muscle here is called the gaskin. We want a very prominent gaskin right through there. We want a big forearm is what this muscle is called. Up front, in front of a horse, we can look and we'll call it pectoral V. They'll actually have pectoral muscles right up front, and we want those to be very prominent pectoral muscles, and we want them to be very lean and defined. So we don't want horses to have a very smooth appearance. We want them to be very shapely and defined, just like this particular horse is here. As we go and talk about our final priority, we talked about breed and sex characteristics. Differences here, this would be a stallion. So we want a stallion to look masculine. We didn't talk about this in our breeding animal selection. We'll talk about it a little bit further down the road. But just like this would be the same thing in whether it's cattle, sheep, swine, goats, or horses. We kind of want our males to be masculine and look like males. That means they're going to have testosterone. That testosterone is going to build secondary sex characteristics. So this particular stallion here has a very strong jaw. He has a thicker neck. He's going to have a little more muscle, and he's going to have a little stronger appearance to him. Whereas females, we want to look like females. We want them to be feminine and very ladylike and more refined. And that's going to be coming from a lack of testosterone and a higher case of estrogen running through there. That is what defines secondary sex characteristics, and what makes males look like males and females look like females is those hormones on a very basic level. And so this mare, you can see, has a lot cleaner cut through her jaw. She has a lot cleaner throat latch. She's a little more well-defined. She has a nice, what we consider, kind eye to her. And so they should be able to exhibit both of those characteristics, whether they are a stallion or a mare. Just like in a bull, we want to have a nice crest up to his neck. We want him to look very, what we consider, manly, have a large scrotal circumference. Females, heifers, we don't want them to have as much muscle. We want them to have a little more volume. We want them to be smooth and look like ladies, have a long, clean, feminine neck. And a nice look to them, not have a big crest up there like the bulls do. And so that is important all the way through, but specifically here as we hit on horses, wanted to talk through there. All right, so that is the end of my slideshow here. So we'll stop a share here. So Brooke, Rebecca, do you guys have any questions for me?
I don't think so. I don't know how Rebecca.
And it
No,
can be,
I'm
I
pretty
think you did a
good.
really good job.
what's that? I didn't hear you there, Rebecca.
Oh, I said I'm pretty good. You did a good job explaining. And stuff.
Okay. And so it can be, if you have anything particular, if either of you show any animals or have any questions on that, I can certainly answer questions.
Well, I show Mike and goats, so like, I don't know. I kind of like knew some of this stuff.
Okay.
But, like, what advice do you have more that I might not already have?
So you probably already have your goats. And so
Yeah.
from a structure standpoint here, this is more so on the breeding side. So the next module we'll have will be a little bit more so selection specifically towards those market animals. But width, volume is still very good on those market goats. We want them to still be very structurally sound to where they can get out and move and walk correctly and do that. And then we want them to also be able to have a lot of muscle. So muscle would be a big difference, and having the right amount of muscle compared to fat. We don't want them to be too fat. We want them to have a nice defined, well-defined muscle. And so still think don't get them too weak pastured. Make sure there's not deviations as far as being cow-hawked or kind of pigeon-toed or splay-footed. Try to keep those animals as square and, like Brooke talked about earlier, boxy as you can possibly make.
Yeah.
Will definitely be beneficial.
Okay. Thanks.
You bet. All right. Any other questions?
Nope, I think I'm good.
All right. Very good.
So,
Robin?
I would just say, Caleb, I think you did an excellent job. So this is recorded and it'll be posted for the rest of the kids that didn't get to come on live tonight.
Okay.
And if you're okay, we can provide your contact information if they have any questions.
You bet.
Very, very good. Thank you very much.
Make sure and provide both my email and phone number and if they have any questions.
Absolutely. And then Brooke and Rebecca, your quiz I think is posted now, so you should be able to go online and take that, okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Perfect.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Robin.
Okay.
Thank
Take care.